Hello, my sewing friends. It's Corrine from the Sewing Works, and welcome to another episode of I Can Sew Make That. Today, I'm working on a quilt project that involves over 300 flying geese, and I was trying to consider which is the best method to create all these geese. Now, many of you have probably used patterns that have told you to use some of the various methods that I'm about to show you, but some of them use more fabric, some use less, some are easier for different reasons. And so let's talk about the pros and cons of all these different methods. I'm going to show you 4 ways to make flying geese today, so let's fly right in. This first method I'm going to show you is a no waste method that you sew 1 goose unit at a time. When you're originally cutting your units, you typically make a 4 goose piece when you're cutting your goose fabric, because it is important that you have the straight of grain on the bottom and your bias running on the top edges. So to cut this properly, you usually end up with a square. Today we're making 2 finished 2x4 geese. So my square starts out 5 1/4 and I cut it on both diagonals. The sky pieces are 2 7/8 cut once on the diagonal. So you would need 4 of these little squares to complete the other 3 segments. But for the first unit, you only need 1 square. So you're going to lay the sky piece down, so your 1/4 inch seam, press out, and then repeat that on the other side. So sew it down, press out. And for demonstration purposes, I have shown you this final unit is trimmed up, and I do always like to trim up my geese at the end. We'll talk about that kind of when we get to the next method, so that I get rid of all these little points and really square up my edges. So this is how much waste I had when I squared up my goose unit using method 1, sewing 1 at a time. Method 2 I'm going to show you sews 1 at a time, but it uses a stitch and flip method. So you don't have to cut anything on the bias first, which might be easier. So you'll take 2 sky squares at 2 1/2 inches, and your goose unit is cut at 2 1/2 by 4 1/2. You place your sky fabric with a mark on it over the edge of your goose unit and sew your 1/4 inch seam. Once again, you're going to press that out, repeat for the other side, and this is what you end up in the end. Now, I do not like the stitch and flip method because I almost always don't have this big enough. And one thing that really drives me crazy is it's very hard to get a 1/4 inch at the very top, so I often struggle to keep my points from getting cut off when I sew these units together. One of the advantages is not only the no waste, but you end up with this cute little half square triangle piece that you can sew these together to create separate units to make another quilt top or another small project. However, these units are kind of an oddball size and usually have to be squared down, so they do end up wasting a little bit of fabric. And if you aren't using these for something, then that would be considered your fabric waste. One of the advantages to method 1 over method 2 is there's no marking. So you don't have to worry about marking that line ahead of time, but it does give you a nice line to follow. Now let's move on to method 3. This is probably the most popular method I find on the internet, where you sew 4 at once. You're going to start with 1 square background, and it is cut at 5 1/4, and 4 small squares at 2 7/8. These squares, you're going to mark, again, you're going to use your marking tool to mark on the diagonal. Put these down, right sides together, and sew 1/4 inch on either side of the line. Then you trim down that line. Once you've trimmed them apart, you'll have 2 units that look like this. You'll press those sky pieces over, so you kind of have this cool like rocket ship looking thing. And you're going to add one more square marked on the diagonal to your rocket ship. And so once again, on either side of that line, cut down the middle. You'll see here where I have one that's been finished. That turns into two of these. So from start to finish, your square ends up to two of those and then turns into four of the little pieces. And again, I have just about as much waste as I did on the first method, but I certainly have better seam allowance and more accuracy than I did with the stitch and flip method. Now, let me show you my favorite method. May not be yours, but this is the great one for beginners. You start with two squares. One of them, they're both oversized. And keep in mind, you can make the other units oversized in these other applications and trim them down. I just haven't shown you how to do that. Obviously, those methods would create more waste. So this is a 7-inch sky piece and a 5.5-inch goose piece. It's going to turn into 4 goose units. So you put them right sides together and mark the goose piece across the diagonal. And again, you're going to sew on either side of the line using 1/4 inch. After you complete your sewing, you're going to cut on the line and press your goose or half goose units open. Well, not open, you press it towards the sky piece. And then you put these 2 units, you want the dark pieces opposite of each other. Sorry, I'm trying to hold the camera. And obviously I'd line that up a little better. Notice that the 2 seams do not line up in this instance. That is on purpose. You'll mark again on the diagonal, sew on either side of the line, and you'll end up with 2 units that look like this after you press. This is why I love this method, because you have plenty of extra to get 2 1/4 inch seam allowances above your goose and to make sure that these 45-degree angles are looking nice and pretty. So you'll trim that down and you'll see from each goose unit, I end up with this much waste. So it does take a little bit more fabric, but I get very accurate, precise piecing for later. So that happens to be my favorite method, which starts with 2 squares and turns into 4 geese. But all these methods can work well depending on whether you like to sew 1/4 inch from the line, if you like marking, how much cutting you want to do, and then a big thing for people is how much waste fabric they're going to end up with. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of I Can Sew Make That. And I have about 350 more geese to make, so I better fly away. Bye-bye.